So, good day everyone, I am Nhorelhyne and Gernaldo, and together with Miss Tricia Grol, we are going to talk about the theory of behaviorism. So what is behaviorism? So behaviorism, or also known as behavioral psychology, is a theory or learning based on the idea that all behaviors are acquired through conditioning and reinforcement, or rewards and punishment. So it occurs through interaction with the environment. So behaviorists believe that our responses to environmental stimuli shape our actions. So this theory of behaviorism largely came from the psychologists and scientists Pavlov, Watson, Thorndike, and Skinner. So Ivan Petrovich Pavlov was a Russian physiologist known primarily for his work in classical conditioning or stimulus substitution. So he was born on September 26, 1894 at Ryazan, Russia. So Pavlov was the founder of the classical conditioning. So what is classical conditioning? So classical conditioning of Pavlov is a behavioral mechanism in which a biologically potent stimulus is paired with a previously neutral stimulus. So his most renowned experiment involved meat, a dog, and a bell. Initially, Pavlov was measuring the dog's salivation in order to study digestions. So you can see in the slide, we have the three stages of conditioning. We have before conditioning, during conditioning, and after conditioning. So as you can see, before conditioning, ringing the bell caused no response from the dog. Placing food in front of the dog initiated salivation. So during conditioning naman, the bell was rung a few seconds before the dog was presented with the meat or a dog food. So that's how the classical conditioning works. So for example naman, in other situation, the father wears a cup and took his son into a baseball tournament. So whenever the father wears a cup, the kid initiated that his father will take him into a baseball tournament. So every time nga mag-wear iya nga papa sa kalo, maunaw-naan sa kid nga, ay dal una day ko ni papa sa baseball tournament. So that will make the kid more happy. And now let us talk about the Pavlov's findings about the classical conditioning. So the first one is stimulus generalization. So it is a tendency of a new stimulus to evoke responses or behaviors similar to those elicited by another stimulus. So for example, once the dog has learned to salivate at the sound of the bell, it will salivate at other similar sounds. So once nga ang dog maka-learn siya salivate sa sounds ng bell, na tendency nga mag-salivate siya sa ibang sound para sa sound sa pito or anything nga mo-create og sounds. So the second one is extinction. So it occurs when the conditioned stimulus applied repeatedly without being paired with the unconditioned stimulus. So for example, if you stop pairing the bell with the food, salivation will eventually cease in response to the bell. So kung isa po, i-ring nimo ang bell pero why nimo gigamit ang food, wala, hindi nimo sila gi-pair duwa, but instead giring nimo ang bell, then ginapak abi nimo ang ido or gisakit siya nimo. So salivation will cease in response. Dili magutom ang ido or dili siya mukaon. The third one is spontaneous recovery. So it is a phenomenon of learning and memory which refers to the re-emergence of a previously extinguished conditioned response after a delay. So for example, extinguished responses can be recovered after an elapsed time but will soon extinguish again if the dog is not presented with food. So the fourth one is discrimination. So it is the ability to distinguish between one stimulus and similar stimuli. So for example, the dog learned to discriminate between similar bell stimuli and discern which bell would result in the presentation of food and which would not. So the dog has an idea which bell would present the food and which would not. So kabalo sila mag-differentiate sa duwa ka similar bells. So the last one is the higher order conditioning. So it refers to a situation in which a stimulus that was previously neutral is paired with a conditioned stimulus. So for example, once the dog has been conditioned to associate the bell with food, another unconditioned stimulus such as light may be flashed at the same time that the bell is rung. Eventually the dog will salivate at the flash of the light without the sound of the bell. So kung once nga nag-associate ang dog sa sound ng bell and may another unconditioned stimulus like flashlight, then the flashlight was on the moment ka nag-ring ang bell, may tendency nga ang dog kay salivate siya sa light, sa flashlight. So the second behaviorist is John B. Watson. So John B. Watson was an American psychologist who popularized the scientific theory of behaviorism, establishing it as a psychological school. So he believed that psychology should primarily be scientific observable behavior. So he is remembered for his research on the conditioning process and also known for the Little Albert experiment. So in the slide, you will see the Little Albert experiment, in which John B. Watson demonstrated that a child could be conditioned to a fear previously neutral stimulus. So we have the classical conditioning to condition an emotional response. 9-month-old Albert exposed to stimuli and observed. Then, while rat paired with loud noise, so Albert conditioned to fear of the rat. So, whenever makakita si Albert sa rat, ginapair siya sa loud sound. So, in result, whenever makita ni Albert ang rat, mahadlok siya, so he will cry and fear. So that is John B. Watson's behaviorism through the Little Albert experiment. So the third psychologist is Edward Lee Thorndike. So Edward Lee Thorndike was an American psychologist who spent nearly his entire career at Teachers College, Columbia University. So his work on the comparative psychology and the learning process led to the theory of connectionism and helped lay the scientific foundation for educational psychology. So he was the founder of the connectionism theory. So what is the connectionism theory? So, connectionism is a learning achieved when an individual is able to form associations between particular stimulus, S, and the response, R. So, by trial and error, animals identify connections between stimulus and a satisfying consequences. So, we all know naman na all our actions responds to a certain consequences. So, it states that learning has taken place when a strong connection or bond between stimulus and response is formed. So, Edward Lee Thorndike came up with 3 primary laws. So, the first one is the law of effect. So, it suggested that when satisfaction follows an association, it is more likely to be repeated. So, if an unfavorable outcome follows an action, then it becomes less likely to be repeated. So, for example, if you do a certain moves or action and it resulted into a nice and successful outcome, and then you will be gladly to do it again. But if your action resulted into a fail or mistake, then diba mahadlok na kamusab, and then muna na lang ka stop na enough, and then lesson learned, dila na ni maliwaton. But if your outcome is successful, then syempre liwaton na ni maliwat. If successful man, then you are not hesitant to be afraid nga dili na nimo buhaton usab. So the second one is law of exercise. So it states that in learning, the more frequently a stimulus and response are associated with each other, the more likely the particular response will follow the stimulus. So practice makes perfect seem to be associated with this. So the law of exercise implies that one learns by doing and one cannot learn a skill. So for instance, by watching others, it is necessary to practice the skill because by doing so, the bond between stimulus and response is strengthened. So the third and last law is the law of readiness. So the law of readiness states that the more readiness the learner has to respond to the stimulus, the stronger will be the bond between them. So, for example, an athlete who is highly motivated and eager to learn is more likely to be receptive to learning than one who is poorly motivated. So, in a law of readiness, it states that learning is dependent upon the learner's readiness to act, which facilitates the strengthening of the bond between stimulus and its response. So, at these slides, we have principles derived from Thorndike connectionism. So, 1, learning requires both practice and reward. So, law of effect or exercise. So, of course, if you do practice, you have your rewards. It's either development mo, improve ka. So, number 2 is a series of S and R, or stimulus and response connection, can be changed together if they belong to the same action sequence. So, law of readiness. So, number 3, transfer of learning occurs because of previously encountered situation. So, the fourth one is intelligence is a function of the number of connection learned. So, let's go go with the operant conditioning. It's based upon the notion that learning is the result of a change in overall behavior. Changes in behavior are the result of an individual's response to events, stimuli that occurs in the environment. Reinforcement is the key element in Skinner's theory. A reinforcer is anything that strengthens the desired response. There is positive and negative reinforcer. First, I will tackle about the negative reinforcer. It's any stimulus that results in an increased frequency of response when it is withdrawn or renewed. Example of it is deciding to take an antacid before you indulge in spicy meal. This negative reinforcer is reminding you to avoid the positive outcome. So in this example, I decide to take the antacid before I eat the spicy meal because I know in the future my stomach might hurt. So I decided to take an antacid to prevent my stomach to ache. So let's go with positive reinforcer. It is any stimulus that is given or added to increase the response. For example, of it is a dog trainer is giving biscuit to a dog to perform the trick. It is one way of motivating the dog to perform the trick. Another is a father providing his child with a piece of candy for picking up toys. That is one way of also motivation to the kid to he or she pick the toy for her to pick the toy, right? Then next example of a positive reinforcer is a teacher handing out gold stars to children to turn in their homework on time. That example also is also a positive reinforcer because you motivate your students to take over their assignments on time because they will get the gold star. So that's it. So to wrap up, therefore I conclude, behaviorism, also known as behavioral psychology, is a theory of learning based on the idea that all behaviors are acquired through conditioning and reinforcement, which occurs through interaction with the environment. So there are psychologists who do the studies. For example, is Pavlov, who study about the spontaneous recovery, which is the phenomenon of learning and memory. And the higher order conditioning, which refers to situation with stimulus that was previously neutral as paired with conditioned stimulus. Another one is Boris Frederick Skinner, who was an American psychologist, behaviorist, author, inventor, and social philosopher. Another is Edward Lee Thorndike, who was an American psychologist who spent nearly his entire career at Teachers College, Columbia University. This is also one of the, here in the lesson is the connectionism. The learning is achieved when individual is able to form associations between a particular stimulus and its response R. States that learning has taken a place when strong connection or bond between stimulus and response is formed. The law of effect suggested that when satisfaction follows an association, it is more likely to be repeated. Principles delivered from Thorndike connectionism. Law of exercise. It states that learning more frequently as a stimulus and response are associated with each other, and the more the particular response will follow the stimulus, shaping of behavior, is a conditioning paradigm used primarily in experiment. All analysis of behavior. The method used in differential reinforcement of successive approximations. So, that's all. Thank you.